Cool. All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome back to another fun edition of Human Anatomy. In advance of today's class, you had just a little bit of reading in the textbook and a video. I just assigned the first crash course video for today, which actually is very much in line with what we're talking about. We started in on the nervous system on Monday, and we are going to continue the nervous system today. So this is what our agenda looks like. It's a long agenda today, actually. Got all kinds of stuff going on. Keep us on our toes. We're going to start with a super fun warm-up activity, and you're going to think about the four divisions, the four ways that we can describe aspects of the peripheral nervous system, being either sensory or somatic, and being either visceral or visceral or somatic, and being either sensory or motor. So we're going to get into that. And we're going to continue talking about the nervous system, get into some anatomy at the microscopic level, talk about tissues and cells. And I've got Human Anatomy in the News that has one of my favorite all-time quotes from a researcher in it. And you'll see what that is. And then we're going to continue the nervous system. And then I'm going to wrap things up today. I've got a few scheduling updates and reminders. I mentioned last class that I have some information for you about quizzes and exams coming up. And I also need to clarify the time of our final. And then I've got a ticket out for you. So as we're working through today, don't forget you've got a study guide. This provides a link to the Google Slides that has a lot of the diagrams that we'll be looking at, hopefully useful for you. So go ahead, you can pull that up. And before I dive in, what questions do you have? Yes.
Did you mention the Polaris Longus thing?
No, it's secret. No.
Oh.
Yeah, I can't. Ethan pointed out yesterday that apparently 14% of the population actually doesn't have the muscle, the palmaris longus, one of the ones we looked at in lab yesterday. And you can see the tendon if you cross your pinky and your thumb like this, and you kind of flex at the wrist, you can see a large tendon right there in the middle. And you can use that to indicate if you have that muscle. I need to look into a little more about why some people don't have it, but there you go. What's that?
Is it crucial to have it, or is it just benefits?
Well, I mean, I would say that the fact that we don't really know which of us might have it and which doesn't indicates that it's not terribly important. Because if you yeah, if it was important and you didn't have it, you'd probably know. You'd be like, oh man, I suck at bowling and I can't do this or whatever. Bowling would be a prime sport. Softball, if you're a pitcher in softball and you're lacking that, you're in trouble. All right, so I want to dive in with an activity today. So we talked about these four divisions of the peripheral nervous system. We have somatic sensory, visceral sensory, somatic motor, visceral motor. So just as a quick reminder, remember that somatic is most often a synonym for voluntary, right? Now, there are some exceptions, such as like reflex arcs and things like that, but generally these are things under conscious control. So somatic motor goes to your skeletal muscle. So these are signals from the central nervous system to skeletal muscle telling them to contract. Somatic sensory generally has to do with the outside environment. So sensory input having to do with the world around you, and primarily via your skin. So you can think of things like heat, pressure, the pain, things like that. Also, there's two special somatic senses. Does anybody remember what those are? Oh, eyes and eyes and ears, right? And the ears are important. Eyes are for vision. Ears are important for what too? Hearing and balance. Good. Then we have the visceral system. The visceral, generally speaking, is more about receiving information from the inside of your body. Although a little bit, so the somatic sensory does include proprioception, so knowing where your body is moving in space. But visceral, you can think of as visceral like your guts, right? So these are the nerves that are delivering information from your digestive system, from your urinary system, et cetera. So this is what tells you that your bladder's full or you've got an upset stomach or something like that. Visceral motor are signals that are generally considered involuntary. I shouldn't say generally, always involuntary. So these are signals telling your body to do stuff that's involuntary. So what are some examples of the tissues that are innervated by these visceral motor nerves? Smooth muscle, I heard somebody say that. Who said that? Boom, good job. Smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. Good. Yep. So those involuntary muscles as well as your glands. Cool. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to put up a list here, and you are going to look at this list and decide which of these 4 categories your action thing belongs to. I kind of ran out of space. So a few of you, there's 2 names for like one thing you'll see. So a few of you have the same thing, but we'll see if you agree, right? So let's go ahead and just take a minute. Do I have a timer for this one? I don't think I do. That's okay. We don't need a timer. Go ahead, find your name, find your action or your experience. I'll call it an experience, and see which of these 4 categories it belongs to. And we'll just do some debriefing. And I'll ask you on your ticket out today, which category your thing belonged to. So just take a little note of it. Bless you. All right, go ahead and turn to your neighbor and tell them which one you have and tell them which category it fits into and trade information. We'll share a few out. Right. All right, let's bring it back here. I want to check in with a couple and see what we've got. So let me do wow, okay, I'm just picking some at random. So Spencer and Hannah W, you guys happen to be sitting next to each other as well and got the same one. Weird. Oh no, not Spencer. Sorry, my bad. Hannah, okay, was Spencer here? No, Spencer's not here. All right, Hannah W, I'm just gonna pick on you. Doing squats. Somatic motor, good. So signal going to those muscles, telling them to contract. In this case, anyone want to guess what muscle you're contracting as you're doing squats? I heard it. Someone said it. Quads. Yeah, your quads. I mean, there's others too that are stabilizing, but primarily you're flexing your quads, and that extends your leg, which is gonna lift you up. Right. Good. Let's see. Who else? Let's say Emma, touching a hot pan. What do you got going on there? It is actually somatic sensory, because, well, actually, you know what? It could be either, but it's going to be somatic in either way. So the action of moving your hand to touch the pan, that's somatic motor. Yeah. And then, well, actually, this is a good one. We can walk through this. Then it's somatic sensory is going to be that feeling of heat on your fingers, right? Then you do have this heat reflux where you're going to retract your hand before that information even goes to your brain. Now, this is actually a good example of a reflex art. We're going to talk about this in class, but this is still somatic, even though it's involuntary, right? Because it's still skeletal muscle that's moving in response. Cool. Let's see here. Who else do we got? Let's say Karime, reading Braille. She's not. I'm picking on everybody that's not. I'm just going to keep going through the list and pick on people that aren't here. Michaela, the release of sweat from your sweat glands. Visceral sensory. And why sensory? Explain your answer. Good. So if the prompt was you feel heat from the outside air, then which of these would it be? Anyone can answer. Somatic sensory, right? Because temperature is somatic sensory. But the act of releasing, to opening those sweat glands and releasing sweat, where is that going to fall? Is that sensory coming in, or is that output going out? Output out, and is it going to be somatic or visceral? Visceral. Why visceral? It's involuntary. Exactly. Good. So release of sweat from your sweat glands is going to be visceral motor. Good. Let's pick Joe. You big Missy Elliott fan? Good, excellent answer. A+. What system is hearing your favorite Missy Elliott song? I mean, they're all good, right? Oh, yeah. What's your favorite though? Yeah, work it. Okay, yeah, work it's a good one. That's cool. Which of the, because you can't tell me because there's so many good
Yeah,
ones,
exactly,
right?
exactly.
Right, okay. Which of these systems is best fits listening to that song?
I said somatic sensory,
And explain.
because I'm listening to it with my ears, and my ears is one of the two somatic senses.
The special somatic senses. Good, excellent, excellent, excellent. Let's pick on a couple others. Let's say Astrid and Sam getting an upset stomach. Did you both pick the same one?
I don't know.
What did you say, Sam?
Visceral, like, sensory.
Visceral sensory, visceral sensory. Good. Why do you say visceral sensory?
Feel like it's the feeling inside your stomach.
It's not nauseous.
Okay, and where's the message going from and to in this case?
From your stomach up.
Yep, from your stomach to the central nervous system, visceral sensory. Good, good. Let's pick maybe one or two more. Oh, let's see, Grace M. The sweet, sweet taste of a strawberry.
I said visceral sensory because the special is taste or smell.
Yeah, good, excellent. So remember, I talked about the two special somatic senses. We have two special visceral senses as well. And that is what, Grace?
Taste and smell.
Good, good. So taste of a strawberry. Good. You like strawberries?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. Good. Good answer there. Okay. Let's see. All right. Let's do one more. Let's do Brooke and Grace I. You happen to be sitting next to each other. That's convenient. Did you get the same one?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
The sensation, you said it was somatic sensory.
Good. Yeah. Because it's a feeling, right? It's tactile senses. Yeah. Exactly. You have a cat, either of you? No, you don't have cats? Okay.
Would this be too though? Because we were also
Mhm.
talking about it being somatic motor in the sense of if you have to like voluntarily like go to pet your cat.
Yep. And I tried to make it specific with my prompt saying the sensation of petting your cat, but you're absolutely right. It would be somatic motor that's controlling your hand and your fingers to make that motion happen. Good. All right, let's just do one more. Let's see, let's find another pair one. Let's do Mayuka and Hannah B. Where are you both there? What did you say for yours?
I said visceral sensory because you were just smelling it,
So
and that's one of the top sensory, like senses
Mhm.
for visceral sensory.
good. Mayuka, do you agree?
I did somatic sensory.
Mm.
I thought it was like one of the bigger, like you're smelling something from the outside.
Mhm.
but It's not like an inside sense.
Yes, so that your logic is sound, but Hannah is correct here. The exception here is for visceral sensory. Remember, visceral sensory, we have two special visceral senses. And those are taste and smell. So that goes back to Grace eating her strawberries over there. That is visceral sensory as well, because that is taste, and in this case, oops, not small, sorry, smell. Good, that makes sense? Yep, Dan, go ahead.
Did we go over all the notes for like visual motor and then somatic motor?
We did, yeah. There wasn't too many. I mean, there's not a ton to say other than signals from the central nervous system, either to skeletal muscle or to cardiac, smooth, or glands.
So I know taste is a visceral sensory.
Mhm.
But as soon as something like passes your mouth, like if you were to like injure the inside of your cheek, is
Mhm.
that still visceral sensory then?
That's a great question. So an injury like that to the epithelial tissue in your cheek, I believe is going to be somatic sensory, because
Okay.
that's like if you burn the inside of your mouth or something like that.
So then once it reaches the I can't remember.
Esophagus?
Esophagus.
Yeah. Where is that dividing line?
Yeah.
Yes, I don't know the answer to that. It's a really good question. I'll have to look into that because so I'm thinking of the example of if you burn your tongue, which is that, because the tongue taste is going to be visceral, but burning sensation is generally somatic. I need to get back to you on that one. That's a good question. Yeah, I don't know exactly where that line is for those. Yeah, good. Anyone else have one on here that they're not sure about? Want to check in? Cool. Yeah, Dan.
So just to review, the somatic motor is just you moving and you either consciously or unconsciously moving, depending on if it's a reflex arc. If it's a reflex arc, that's the only example that it's not conscious.
Yeah, and generally what you can think of this is muscles that you can control consciously. So in a reflex arc, let's say your patellar reflex, where your rectus femoris here contracts, right? When they hit your kneecap with the hammer at the doctor's office. In that case, it is an involuntary reflex response, but in general, you can control your rectus femoris. You have conscious control of that. Your eyes blinking are another example. So that's somatic motor. All of you are blinking your eyes involuntarily all the time, except for now when I just brought it to your attention. Now you're all thinking about blinking your eyes, but that's exactly my point, is that you can control that voluntarily as you do. So there are in some places that somatic motor is involuntary, but generally those are muscles that you can control consciously.
So those are skeletal muscles.
Skeletal muscles.
When you blink, those muscles are skeletal.
Skeletal muscles, yeah. We're going to learn about those. Well, we'll talk about those, touch on those briefly. We're not going to there's a whole mess of muscles in there controlling your eye. So. Yeah, questions here.
Just sort of be on the quiz,
Mhm.
will you be very specific, like, in the scenario, how it's like, if it could be like involuntary, voluntary, like. things like that.
Absolutely. I will try to be as explicit as possible, because my intention isn't to give you like a gray area and have you try to guess. Like, I want to do something where it's clear cut. So, yeah, that's a good question. And so here's a table. This is a table that summarizes the information that I just presented. And this is in your book too. So you've got that table 12.1 in the text. Cool. Good review. Other questions? Feeling confident in those 4 categories? All right, well, let's continue talking about nervous tissue. I want to get a little more of the specific anatomy of the nervous system here, and specifically the nervous tissue. And so nervous tissue contains 2 main cell types. And nervous tissue is actually really dense, meaning this tissue is really packed closely together. And the 2 main types of cells that we find in nervous tissue are neurons. This is probably the one that's the most famous, that gets all the attention, right? And these are these highly specialized cells that basically have one job, and that job is to conduct an electrical impulse known as an action potential along its plasma membrane. You see an example of a neuron here. It's sending a signal from this cell body out to here. We're going to talk about all of these parts of the cell in more detail coming up. But the takeaway message here is that these neurons are really good at doing just one thing. So think of this as like, I'm trying to think of an example of something like maybe from sports, someone that's really good at doing one thing. A field kicker, good. So in a football game, the player has exactly one job to do, and that's all they do, right? Bless you. So neurons are really good at doing this one thing, which is transmitting this action potential. We also have a whole bunch of other cells that are called support cells, or in the central nervous system, we refer to them as neuroglia cells, or neuroglial cells, or just neuroglia, or sometimes just glial cells. And these are cells that are nervous tissue cells, but they are not excitable, meaning that they don't transmit these electrical impulses, and they do basically everything else. So you have these one kind of cells that transmit the electrical impulses, and several other types of cells, and we're going to look at those in detail, that basically help those neurons do the best job that they can. So that's why they're called support cells. Sound good? All right, so let's look at this in a little more detail. First, I'm going to talk to you about neurons. Then I'm going to talk to you about these different types of support cells. So neurons have several special characteristics. First is longevity. So these cells generally form very early in development, and most of them, but not all, but in general, they are formed once, and that's the cell, and they last your entire life. So this single cell, in many cases, can live for 100+ years, hopefully. It's not like, this is in contrast to, say, epithelial cells that line your esophagus or your skin, that you're constantly regenerating, constantly shedding, right? These guys are the opposite. They're formed once and they stay with you your whole life. Because of this function, they don't generally divide. Once these neurons are formed early in development during the fetal stage, they lose their ability to undergo mitosis. And so they're not creating new cells. They're formed once and they're just there. There are some exceptions in the central nervous system to this, but in general, we're going to think of these neurons as being amitotic, meaning that they don't undergo cell division and produce more neurons. They are highly energetically demanding. As I said, they have one job and one job only, but that job takes a lot of energy because by very definition, you're transmitting electrical impulses. And so to make that happen, you have to shuttle a lot of ions across plasma membranes, and that just takes a lot of energy. And so they need oxygen and they need glucose specifically for fuel. So they rely on aerobic metabolism, which requires oxygen and requires some kind of energy substrate, glucose being the most readily available. And so this is why, for example, if anyone's experienced like hypoglycemia, or especially in the case of diabetes, but just in general, you can experience hypoglycemia. One of the first things that happens is you get a little foggy headed, like your brain isn't working so well. And that's because your brain is the most sensitive to this lack of glucose, this lack of sugar or a fuel substrate. And they don't function very well, don't last very long without that constant input. So those are three special characteristics of the neurons. I want to talk about the structure of those cells in a little more detail in the next slide, but let me get Sarah's question
Is
first.
that why someone that has like nerve damage, just like, it's so hard for them to just like create, like if someone were to have like nerve damage in their hand, it's just like they can't gain as much like control of their hand because the cells do not divide with those neurons.
Exactly. They don't regenerate very well. I mean, they can repair themselves. So there are places and times where you can get some regeneration and repair, but it's slow and limited, very much so. And, that's why something like brain damage too is often either takes a really long time or it never heals at all. Or so that's why something like a stroke can be so terrible, right? Because it can just take years and years to heal if it ever does at all. And the tissue just doesn't regenerate very well.
Does the stroke happen because someone just like suddenly has like neurons firing or something?
And actually what happens, and this ties exactly back to this, is it generally happens, there's a blood clot in some of the small capillaries that serves the brain. And so this area of tissue doesn't get oxygen and glucose. And very quickly that can create permanent damage to those cells because those cells need it. And they don't last very long without it. Yep. That's exactly. And that's why with a stroke, it's so important to get to like medical care as soon as possible. Like every minute counts, because every minute that's not treated and that blockage continues, the more cells that are losing their oxygen and glucose and are dying. That's why stroke, like medical care, like every second counts really. Good question. Yeah, that's exactly ties into this. Other questions? I had a good friend that had a stroke. She's young. She's not like, she's my age and she had a stroke like 2 years ago, just out of nowhere. And it's been like crazy watching her healing process and how friggin' slow it's been. It's really excruciating. All right, let's look at the structure of a motor neuron. So this is a neuron that's delivering information from where to where? Starting from the central nervous system, and it's going to a muscle or potentially, it could be if it's somatic motor, it'll be going to what kind of tissue? Skeletal muscle. If it's visceral motor, it could be going to what? Glands, smooth muscle, cardiac muscle. Good. So this is what a motor neuron, it's a generalized schematic. They kind of look like this in places, but there's some variation. We're going to go with this. Some important pieces of the anatomy of this neuron I want you to know. The first is the cell body, which is sometimes called the soma or the perikaryon. This is the kind of, bigger part of the cell that contains a lot of cytoplasm, contains a lot of organelles like your mitochondria, your endoplasmic reticulum, your Golgi apparatuses, whatever the plural that is, a whole bunch of that good stuff there. And you see from this cell body, we see these processes coming out of the cell body. Oh, excuse me, let me back up for 1 second. Failed to mention the nucleus is in the cell body. So it's super important to note that as well. From this cell body come two types of processes, which simply mean the same as we looked at in a bone. A process is like a piece that sticks out, exact same meaning here, pieces that stick out. We have something called dendrites, and these deliver signals from other places to this cell body. So they're like antennae kind of, right? They're delivering information in. And then we have something called an axon. Generally, you just have one of these. And this is where the action potential travels away from the cell body down to the next neuron or whatever tissue it's innervating. You can remember this. I always remember axon away, both start with the letter A. So axons are delivering information away from that cell body. They travel down here and at the very end, that axon splits into something called this terminal arborization. And this ends in something called these terminal boutons, which is where neurotransmitters are secreted. I'm going to get to this a little more detail. I just want to introduce you to the general anatomy now. So we have the cell body. At this transition point between the cell body and axon, we have something called the axon hillock. We'll get to this in more detail. Actually, well, we don't really talk about this in too much in this class. In physiology, those of you that took A&P with me, this is probably ringing some bells for you. If you've taken 325 or going to, you'll talk more about the physiology of this. But the axon hillock is important because this is where this electrical impulse begins. It travels down this axon, and then that signal ends up here at the terminal boutons where neurotransmitters are released to signal the next cell to do something. And so these neurons communicate with each other at something called a synapse. And the synapse is at the end of the axon here at these terminal boutons. And what happens is at the synapse, it's a small gap between the neuron that's sending the signal and the cell that's receiving the signal. And at this gap, something called a neurotransmitter is released. And you've probably all heard the term neurotransmitters, right? Most synapses are axodendritic, which you see here, which means that the axon of the presynaptic neuron sends a signal to the dendrite of the postsynaptic neuron. Hence, axo for axon and dendritic for dendrite here. So axodendritic. Most of the synapses are of this nature. There's a few that are what's called axosomatic. Does anybody want to guess what axosomatic synapse looks like?
One that's directed to the muscle.
For axodendritic, we know that axo refers to axon, dendritic refers to dendrite.
Oh, it's towards us.
Axosomatic, what do you think the axo stands for? Axon, what about somatic? Soma, yep, the cell body. Remember, just going back, the cell body is also known as the soma. So in this case, the axon interfaces directly with the cell body, not with those dendrites. We don't have too many of those. This is the only time I'm going to mention it, but I just thought it'd be fun to bring that up. Good times. All right, so this is a general idea of a synapse, is that we're transmitting information from a presynaptic neuron to a postsynaptic neuron, or this can be other tissue type. This can be a muscle cell or a gland or something like that. But we're just going to do neuron to neuron connections right now.
I just want to clarify something.
Yep.
So is the whole tail the axon?
This is the axon.
Okay.
And the axon splits here in these terminal arborizations. And then the very end is something called the terminal bouton.
Gotcha.
And that's where those neurotransmitters come out.
But the terminal arborizations are still part of the axon.
Yeah, you could call them still part of the axon networks. Although if I ask you for a diagram and tell you to label the axon, label this part basically. Yeah, the obvious part. And so let's look at a synapse in a little more detail here. This is about as much physiology as we're going to get into with this. Those of you that took A&P with me, and we spent like 3 days talking about action potentials, and you probably wanted to kill me. Be grateful that we're not going to get into that level of detail in this class. So axodendritic synapse, basically what happens is that signal comes down. This is the presynaptic neuron here, meaning this is where the signal is coming from. That electrical impulse is sent down here. And what happens when it gets here is that electrical impulse signals these vesicles, which are basically like a sack, right? It's a bag of neurotransmitters. It signals them to move towards the edge of the cell here, this neurolemma, and fuse with the membrane and release those neurotransmitters across there. So neurotransmitters are how neurons communicate with other neurons. And that's why They're so important. We hear, I don't know, different things in the popular media about problems with neurotransmitters or neurotransmitters being overabundant or underabundant. That's how drugs work, like, I don't know, cocaine or something like that. What it does is it basically tricks the receiving cell into thinking it's getting a bunch of neurotransmitters, and that receiving cell is like, hey, all right, this is great. Until very shortly afterwards, it's not great. So don't do coke. That's my advice for today. So yeah, this is how that electrical signal is translated into a chemical signal, and that transmits across this area. And what's this area called again here, this gap? Synapse, right? So those cells aren't actually touching each other. One thing I want to make clear, and this isn't often made clear in textbook diagrams and things like that, this isn't just like a vacuum or gas. This is all filled with fluid, right? So just remember that everything you see here, all of these cells are surrounded by this fluid. And so these neurotransmitters are floating through fluid to get there. They're not just, it's not empty space. Question again.
Two things, is the fluid just cerebrospinal fluid?
Depends where you are in the body. Yeah, it just depends where this interface is. And generally the cerebrospinal fluid isn't actually the fluid that, well, we'll see this in detail, but it's not actually the fluid that's between the cells in the brain. It's kind of surrounding the brain. But it's a little more complicated than that, but that's basically.
And then like do we just need to like, some of like the parts here?
Yeah, I'm just focusing on the anatomy, not in the physiology. I mean, getting into the neurotransmitters is a bit of physiology, but I do want you to know the structural anatomy of this. So we have an electrical signal coming down the axon. We have the terminal bouton. We have this vesicle that's releasing these molecules across the synapse. And those molecules signal to the next neuron, whatever it is that they're signaling. And it can be serotonin or what's the other, dopamine or something like that.
Do nerves specialize in the type of neurotransmitter they release? Like there's only one, like does it only release one and that's it? Like or does it have a ton that it can release?
No, it has, they can release different neurotransmitters, but the ratios of them can differ depending on where the nerve is. And that's about as much as I know about exactly how that works. That's another good question, Ethan. You're pushing the boundaries of my knowledge of neuroscience. Take a neuroscience class. Maybe someone knows who's taking a neuroscience class. Do you know that? Because those classes get into much more detail on this stuff than I get
I
into.
just remember physiology, Dr. Kenyon mentioned like how, like you said, like some cells are gonna, or some neurons are gonna be able to like send like maybe just one, because that's just like what that specific neurons gonna like send, depending on the area of the body. like you said,
So some are specialized then?
Yeah.
Okay.
In a way. but,
There you
like,
go.
It's not like they won't deny, like, oh, we're not gonna like move these neurotransmitters because we don't know what they are. Like,
Right.
they'll do it, but they
Right.
might- Yeah.
Begrudgingly. Yeah, like, oh man, dopamine again. This job sucks. Okay, cool. So yeah, that's a great question. It's something that was worth investing. That's 2 questions. Make sure you mark down those questions because I want to answer both of those for you. Brooke, go ahead.
I just have a clarifying like anatomy question. So the terminal like bouton, is that just like, that's solely one of the vibrations like from the neuron?
Yeah, so the terminal bouton is going to be like
So only one of those like does the synapse like at a time?
this.
Not all of them?
Good question. What's cool is a signal will come down, and then these terminal boutons will be associated often with other dendrites of other cells. And so the signal then is transmitted to like a whole bunch of other cells.
Okay.
So very often a signal gets transmitted not just to like one other cell. It's not necessarily like a chain. It's more like a web. And that can go to other cells, and there's all kinds of cross communication. In some cases, it's just one other cell, but some cases it's like many, many cells.
So they would all be firing at the same time?
Yes, yeah, because they're all getting that signal from the action potential as it travels down the axon. Good question. Yep. Cool. All right. So let's take a step back out now. So we took steps way in looking at the microstructure of your neurons. I want to take a step out and look at more of the gross anatomy of the nervous system. So most of those cell bodies or soma of the neuronal cells are located within the central nervous system, but sometimes there's clusters, sometimes they cluster up in the central nervous system, in which case we call that a nuclei. Acknowledgement right here, this term I don't like, it's super confusing because we talk about the nucleus of a cell, and now we're talking about nuclei as a group of the cell bodies in the central nervous system. Exact same word, 2 totally different meanings. I apologize, I didn't come up with the lingo here, but just be mindful that when we say nucleus or plural nuclei, if we're talking about a cell, we're referring to that packet of genetic information in the cell body. If we're talking about the nervous system, we mean a group of these cell bodies lumped together. And so this is a cross section of your medulla, which is part of your brain. We'll talk about that soon. And you can see these groups of these cell bodies in the medulla. If these cell bodies group up in the peripheral nervous system, we call these ganglia. And these are groups of cell bodies that are lumped together in the peripheral nervous system. And so we see this, for example, here, this is a spinal cord, a cross section. You're going to know this diagram in the structure of this really well, especially in lab coming up. But the takeaway message here is there's a nerve going out and there's this kind of bump here where a bunch of these cell bodies are grouped up. And now it's in the peripheral nervous system, but it's not in the spinal cord anymore. And we call those ganglia. So nuclei and ganglia are simply groups of cell bodies. They tend to cluster up together and then they send their axons and their dendrites going all over the place.
So when they're just in like a single line, like say going down your arm,
Mhm.
that's not a ganglia at all.
No, and generally the nerve that's going down your arm is just going to be a single nerve. So some of these nerves, I should have gotten to that actually. I should have said that earlier. They can be quite long. They could be a meter long. There's nerve that emerges from like the lumbar region of your spine and goes down to your toe. And so that nerve, that axon is like a meter long. And so the case with your arm too, usually it's not a series of neurons sending signals. It's like one axon.
But I've seen it before with that, it's that like long band that runs down your arm, right?
You probably saw some of those in your cat yesterday, actually. You could see some. I didn't really point it out, but I saw a couple of those nerves in the cat arm. Mhm.
So is that just the one nerve or is it a bunch of like super long nerves that are all running together?
It is a nerve, which is a bundle of axons of neurons. And this is actually a topic we're going to cover in a few minutes. So hold that thought. A nerve is a bundle of these axons. And I'll explain that. Yeah. So you're exactly right. You're just a step ahead. But first, I want to talk about the different structure of neurons. I'm not going to get into too much detail of this, but I want you just to be aware of it. They're classified structurally based on the number of processes that they have. And for that, you can see over here a multipolar. So this is a neuron that has lots of dendrites in one axon. So this is like the motor neuron that I just showed you earlier. They're very common in the central nervous system. So they're called multipolar because they've got all of these dendrites going into the cell body and this one axon going out. We also have bipolar cells. These are only found in a couple places, specifically in the eye, the nose, and the ear, associated with the special senses. And they're called bipolar because here we just have two processes coming out from the cell body. We have a long dendrite going in and a long axon going out. So multipolar, lots of dendrites, lots of processes going in and out of that cell body. Bipolar, just two, and unipolar, you guessed it, just has one. And unipolar are, they have the cell body, and then you have like one little arm, but then you've got these axon kind of going out in multiple directions. And they're called unipolar because there's only this one process going from the cell body, but don't be fooled, they still have the axon kind of going in two different directions. These guys are a little bit funky. They are found in just a few places in the peripheral nervous system. And actually it's these cell bodies that cluster up in those ganglia that I showed you earlier. So the takeaway here is that there's these three types of structural classifications of neurons: multipolar, bipolar, unipolar. Just looking at my next slide here to see how much detail I want to get in. Yeah, okay, I'm going to leave that there. That's the structural classification. We'll talk about the functional classification in just a second. Let me pause here though, see what questions you have. Yes, I might show you diagrams and say, is this multipolar, unipolar, bipolar, or tripolar? I'll make up a fourth answer that doesn't make any sense.
Are you more likely to use unipolar or pseudo?
Great question. I will most likely use, I'll just call it unipolar. The reason they're called pseudo unipolar, and I'm not going to ask you to know this, but just to explain why I have that up there, is these guys actually start off as bipolar, and then this cell body kind of just migrates up, and you get this single process here. And so they developed from bipolar. So they're developmentally they're bipolar. They look like they're unipolar, so they're sometimes referred to as pseudo unipolar. You don't need to know that though. Yeah. Good. Yeah.
I may have missed this in the right, but what defines a process?
A process is just something coming out of the cell body.
Okay.
So in this case, you've got a whole bunch of processes coming out. You've got all these dendrites, right? And one axon. This one, you just have two. You have one going this way, one going this way, and it's bipolar. This one, you just have one, and it's unipolar.
Okay, so is that one unipolar because the body's kind of removed and it just stems off?
Precisely. Yep.
Okay, so in terms of knowing what type of neuron it is, or just, yeah, I guess what direction. Would we be knowing the pictures, like the images that are drawn, or just like actual images and like, say like, maybe that's like an IT.
Like a microscope slide.
Yeah,
Yeah, no, we're not gonna, looking at microscope slides of this stuff is a mess because there's super dense tissue and it's super hard to pick this stuff out, and it's hard enough to pick out a neuron, let alone tell what kind of neuron it is. So I'm only gonna ask you this stuff with diagrams. And here's some context for, actually, let me get to the next slide here. So I want you to know where we find some of these cells in the body, right? And so this ties into our functional classification. And so we're going to classify these based on the direction the impulse is traveling. Now, remember, axons are one-way streets. They're only sending a signal in one direction. And the direction that that signal is going tells us whether it's a sensory neuron or a motor neuron. So sensory neurons are generally unipolar, except for those few bipolar ones in some specialized cells associated with smell and vision, and what's the other one? Hearing. What's notable about these sensory neurons is their cell bodies are outside of the central nervous system. And so we see a diagram of one of these cells here. And I have this kind of overlaid with this diagram that shows you what's central nervous system and what's peripheral nervous system. And so these cells are delivering information from the periphery outside. They've got this long axon here. The cell body itself is in the peripheral nervous system, but then it transmits that information into the spinal cord of the brain, into the central nervous system. So these cells, these neurons travel from the peripheral to the central nervous system. So it's important to note that neurons can go from peripheral to central. They're not limited to one or the other. Sensory neurons, especially, are delivering that information in. They're these unipolar cells, and their cell bodies, notably, are in the peripheral nervous system, not in the CNS. Now, that's information going to the central nervous system. We also have information going out, and those are, of course, motor neurons. Most of the time, these guys are multipolar, and their cell body is within the central nervous system. So these are groups of these cell bodies, for example, in the nuclei of the medulla that I showed you earlier. Let's see. And then they often, their terminal arborization ends not with other neurons, but with muscles or glands, most of those effector cells. This is getting into except postganglionic visceral motor neurons. Don't worry about this just yet. I have this parenthetical phrase here about the postganglionic visceral motor neurons. That's a mouthful. That'll make a little more sense when we get to it. We don't need to worry about that just yet. Now, important to note, let me get to you in a second, Dan, is both, I'm going to go backwards here, both these sensory neurons and these motor neurons travel. In the case of the sensory neuron, they bring information from outside, from the peripheral nervous system to the central nervous system. In the case of motor neurons, they're going from the central nervous system to the peripheral nervous system. In both cases, they're traveling across boundaries between central and peripheral nervous system. However, there's other neurons that stay only in the central nervous system, and these are called interneurons. We'll get into their function in a little more. What's crazy to me, and this still blows my mind every time I see this, is that 99.98 of the neurons in your body are these interneurons. These guys can have a whole variety of funky shapes. I'm not gonna worry about that too much for the purposes of this class, but you can see here that some of them have like this crazy kind of dendrite pattern. These guys are in the brain, they have all of these connections. And so what's really important in the brain is not necessarily the number of cells, but the number of connections between cells. And so you see this crazy branching so that cells can form a lot of communication with other cells. So interneurons are neurons that are found exclusively in the central nervous system. And I want to just show you a diagram here that just shows you some of the crazy structure of neurons. So going back to Dan's question about like, are we going to need to look at microscope size and identify this? No, because it's too complicated. We're just going to go with, okay, there's a lot of like crazy structure, and you can see what some of these looks like. It looks like a tree roots or something. Let me see here. Yeah, that's actually all I want to cover with neurons right now. Let me pause and see what questions you have. We can get to neuroglia next class. Yeah, Ethan.
So just a question on where it goes from, we had where it goes from PNS to CNS,
Mhm.
that's those sensory neurons.
Mhm.
However, with the CNS to PNS, is that the motor neurons as well? Because
Mhm.
you said that they can go outside, but it says that that terminal end there meets with muscles or glands,
Mhm.
so is that also what connects with, like where does the communication go from, or I guess do those just run from your nervous system, your central nervous system, all the way to where they need to go? Okay.
Yep. Generally, there's not any other, there's not like a series of them, but these are those long ones that I was talking about before. Exactly. Yep. Let's see. Actually, this is what time? That clock is slow, isn't it? What time do you have on your 48? Oh my God, we got to finish up. Okay. I was going to do Human Anatomy and News, is my favorite quote ever from a scientific study, but I'm going to have to skip that. Something to look forward to on Friday. In the meantime, oh yeah, I want to go over scheduling stuff. This will just take a minute here. Your lecture quiz is going to be next week, Friday. It's going to be in class, closed book, and it's going to cover the nervous system, everything that we've covered in the nervous system through Monday. So basically everything post spring break through Monday. And it'll be next Friday in class. Your next exam will be the following Friday. It will be in Blackboard. It will be open book. We'll do that instead of class that day. And it will cover the muscles, the skull, and the nervous system. And basically everything we cover through Monday of that week. I won't cover things that we cover just the day before an exam. So I don't like. Question, Emma. Say it one more time.
The quiz will cover skull as well.
Quiz will cover skull as, no, the quiz is only on the nervous system. I'm only going to cover the nervous system with that. Because, well, I should actually do the skull because the other quiz didn't cover the skull. No, we'll just do, no, just the nervous system is fine. Let's just focus on that. Yeah. Yeah. Otherwise you'd be super unpopular. Okay, before you pack up, I know that we're out of time. I'm going to skip the ticket out today. We'll just do that on Friday, but I do want to make sure you have this important information. On the syllabus, I screwed up and I put the wrong date. I don't know how the heck I did this, but I put the wrong date for our final exam. Our final exam is on Friday, the 29th of April from 1:30 to 4:30 p.m. During that exam time, you will do your final lab practical. I like to do the lecture exam during lecture period and the lab practical during this period because it gives us more time to study and prepare for the lab practical, among other reasons, which I think is more useful. This is a more challenging exam. So please take note of this schedule change. I put this on your class program for Friday as well. For Friday, you have some reading, and did I put another video in there? I don't think I did. I think just the reading for Friday. So make sure you got that. Make sure you've got this lab practical time down. Yes, please.
Is the exam gonna be in class or online?
The lecture exam 3?
Yeah.
That will be probably the last lecture period of class, and I haven't decided if I want to do it in Blackboard or in class yet. Yeah, I'll let you know ahead of time, but I haven't figured that out yet. Yeah, good question, Sarah. Okay, let's skip ticket out today. We'll do that Friday. Thank you, everybody. I don't want to keep you late. I'll see you Friday. Let me know if you have questions. You got the activity? Okay.